Silicon Valley startups having a bit of a R&D tax problem. Thanks for putting it on the docket here, Freeberg. It's a bit inside baseball, but very important topic. Let's say a company like Acme Corporation generated $1 million in revenue, and they spent $1 million on their software developers last year. Let's say they had, 5 developers getting paid $200,000 each. Well, traditionally, this company would pay nothing in income tax, right? They spent $1 million. They deduct that $1 million from the $1 million in revenue that came in, and everything's good. But due to the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act of 2017, starting last year, a provision kicked in forcing companies to amortize their R&D expense over 5 years. So in this hypothetical situation, the Acme Corporation would amortize $200K a year and pay income tax on the $800K in profits. This is brutal, obviously, for a
Profits,
startup.
air quotes, profits, air quotes.
Air quotes, profits, correct.
Yeah.
And this is absolutely brutal. And a lot of companies took a wait-and-see approach, hoping Congress would fix the issue. In January, a bipartisan tax bill that would reverse these changes passed in the House. But the bill has stalled in the Senate. And we got to get this thing fixed because it's going to sink a lot of startups. Maybe people will start putting their companies in other countries. But it's attached to this child tax credit, which Republicans don't want to pass. Sort of no reversal has happened. Freeberg, you highlighted this for us. Very important topic. Thank you for doing so. As our great contributor here, what are your thoughts on it?
This became law in the 2017 Jobs Act, as you highlighted. And basically, it means that companies, not just like tech companies, but life sciences companies, defense companies, are pushing Congress to change this law because you can't actually deduct the expenses that you use to run your business. You have to only deduct them over 5 years, 20% a year. So like you pointed out, if you're making $1 million, but you're spending $1 million, you made no profit. But you got to pay taxes as if you made $800,000 in profit. And a lot of these small companies don't have that cash. So venture capital-backed companies and public companies that are profitable, they can afford to do this because they have large balance sheets. So it doesn't affect them as much as it does the literally hundreds of thousands of small businesses that work in the life sciences sector, the defense sector, the tech sector, that are struggling this year to make the tax payments that are required under this law that went into effect last year. And Congress promised that they were going to repeal this law leading up to April 15th, which happened obviously a few days ago, and make it retroactive to 2023, but they didn't.
But Freeberg, they know basic math. Congress knows basic math. What loophole do they think they're closing
here?
Yeah, so the original intent was that this was one of the ways, you guys know, whenever you pass a bill, it gets run through the OMB and the CBO that figures out what's the budgetary cost of the bill.
Yeah.
And one of the ways that they made this work, this bill, the 2017 Trump Tax and Jobs Act, you guys may remember in that bill, they also made it impossible to deduct entertainment and dining expenses when you take people out to dinner anymore.
That sucks.
And they did all those things to make up some of the money they were using for basic general tax breaks for companies. So they use this as a way to say, like, look, in a couple of years, we're going to kick in this R&D expenditure thing, and it'll trigger a lot more revenue for the federal government. It'll create a lot more taxes and a lot more revenue. So that was the idea. And everyone was like, yeah, okay, sure, we'll do that. Great. It makes the accounting work. And then in a couple of years, nudge, nudge, wink, wink, we're going to come back and repeal it. Except Congress has stalled out. There's this ineptitude where anytime someone tries to pass a bill in Congress, someone else says, I want to get money. And so the Democrats showed up and said, we want this child tax credit thing to show up, which basically was passed during COVID. And they want to extend it going forward. And the child tax credit says that you can get a check for $1,800 a year in 2023, $1,900 in 2024, and $2,000 in 2025 for each child you have. And the Republicans in the Senate are saying, wait a second, for people to get this thing, we want to make sure they're working. We want to make sure it's not as retroactive. So now there's this big debate about how big the child tax credit should be. And that's keeping this R&D thing from going through. And meanwhile, I've gotten tons of emails from CEOs of tech companies that are breaking even. These are not tech companies that are making a ton of profit. They're not public. They're not venture backed. They're just people running their business. And now they're going to have this huge tax bill, even though they didn't make any money this year. And it's crippling businesses around the country. And
but what do they do?
They're going to write a check. They're going to borrow money. They're going to go to the bank, borrow money, or they're going to incur penalties with the IRS because they don't have the cash to pay the tax bill because they don't have any profit. They didn't make any money. If they just ran the business break even, which a lot of these companies do, is just make a little bit of money or break even, And then they've got this huge tax bill and profits they didn't actually have. They got to go figure out how to write a check.
And also, how do you define R&D? I was talking to an accountant. He's like, yeah, I don't know if that's R&D. I'm like, you don't know if it's R&D? Like, okay, so if I make some piece of software,
Yeah. There's all this writing in the, if you get audited by the IRS, they have the ability to basically capture everything. So like, let's say you're a mobile app developer and you make $1 million a year, but you spend $1 million a year on your developers.
Okay.
They're going to count that. They have the ability to count that as an R&D. So the accountants, the tax accountants tell you, book it all as R&D, because otherwise you could get audited and actually get in trouble. Because anything that involves the development of technology now is considered R&D. Again, a company working in life sciences as a research company doing lab work can
but if I do bug
fixes,
fixes, is a bug fix R&D? If I make a new feature in an application this year, does it have to be amortized over 5 years? If I put a new filter
I'm
in
not a tax attorney, but my understanding is
most
of the stuff is getting captured, and that's why it's hurting everything from defense to life sciences, to lab equipment, to startups that make software, to everything. And Congress can't get out of its own way, where this bill passed, by the way, bipartisan in the House. Then it went to the Senate, and now it's getting taken apart in the Senate, and now it's stalled out, and everyone's freaking out that it's stalled out past April 15th. And it's actually going to hurt a lot of small businesses in this country. And here's the other problem, is it actually limits our ability to invest in innovation in this country. Because now you're better off. There's no other country in the world that does this. Every other country in the world tries to incentivize investment in innovation. And here in the US, we're basically saying, no, we're going to tax you for investing in technology development and innovation. And the other thing that's actually not being talked about is even in this bill where they're repealing this, they're leaving in the fact that if you invest in R&D outside the US, you have to amortize it over 15 years. So let's say that you're a US developer and you hire people offshore.
Yeah.
You got to basically amortize the offshore stuff over 15 years, which means you'll never make a profit. You're always going to have to pay taxes.
I mean, we're trying to kill innovation in this country. And the two things they got to solve is this one and then M&A. We got to have a better solution for allowing companies to be bought and sold in this or merge in this country. These two things are putting a lot of headwinds on the startup ecosystem and on the venture and the risk-taking capital ecosystems. If you're in Washington, D.C., or you're involved in our government, please solve these two issues. You got to figure out a way to allow companies to be bought and sold. You got to figure out a way to fix this tax issue, or else we're going to kill a lot of startups. And these are the companies that pay a lot of taxes. And these are the capital gains that fund a lot of states' treasuries.
It's also an illustration of just how hungry we are for tax revenue in this country. You know, it's only going to grow. And I'm not sitting here complaining about taxes. You know, the Trump tax cut that he put in place in 2017 added $1.5 trillion to the federal deficit. So tax cuts in general are not great when you're spending a lot, but it does highlight just how much we are spending at the federal level and the demand for tax revenue. And that demand causes this counter-cyclical problem, which is now we're going to eat into innovation, which is supposed to get us out of the problem, the spiral that results from this debt. So it really highlights like just the challenges that are going to emerge, particularly in the decade ahead, because we have all of this spending that's coming in front of us over the next decade, and how we're going to start to demand more and more tax in all these weird ways that can really hurt industry.
Unintended consequences are very real. Chamath, you were going to say something?
Well, doesn't it mean, though, that if you run it at break even and without a lot of growth, by year 5, you'll be back to where you were. So you really have to cover the taxes in years 1 through 4.
That's right. If the business is growing, you're always going to be in a hole.
Right.
Right. So if your revenue is growing and your OpEx is growing, you're always going to be in a hole.
I think Jason mentioned it earlier, and I think it's the key thing, which is what is R&D then?
Yeah.
And maybe you just move things to COGS and just be done with it. I mean, that's what I would do.
Remember businesses, and you guys know this, like when you look at a public company's financials, what you're seeing is their GAAP financials, generally accepted accounting principles. And that's the way that you present the financials of a business. That's different than the way you present financials to the IRS. You don't have a lot of discretion in your tax financials. Your tax financials are actually quite different than your GAAP financials.
Yes.
So when you file your taxes, there's a lot of rules on what you are allowed to deduct and aren't allowed to deduct that's quite different than how you present your corporate financials to investors. And that's really where people get screwed, is you don't have that sort of discretion that you do in kind of sharing your financials with investors. So
this is not financial or accounting advice. Get great representation.
I just hope Congress resolves this, because it's,
yes, super important.